So this is the synth solo that pretty much got me into synthesizers. That was Matt Fink's solo part from the Prince song Head, played on an Oberheim OBXa. I'm going to have a go at recreating it with the Disco DSP plugin OBXD. There's a few things that I really like about this sound and this part. Firstly, it's a really great solo musically, but also he uses some of the features that are kind of unique to the Oberheim OBXa synth that it was played on. And I think it was just really creative to not only come up with a great musical part, but also use the technology of the instrument to really add character to the solo. So I'm going to go through the different elements of this solo, how to make the sound, and then go through how some of the synth-specific parts are played. So let's take a look at the sound first. So I think the first element of this sound is pretty simple. It's a combined square and saw wave, and I'm just going to listen to that by itself. Pretty basic sound. Where the magic really happens with this patch, I think, is that it's a sync sound. So what that means is that one oscillator is going to sync to another oscillator. This is a slightly different thing to pitch tracking, where the pitch of one oscillator will follow the other. What's happening here is that the actual waveform of one oscillator will reset every time the waveform of another oscillator resets. So let's hear what that sounds like. If I turn on the sync button here, and I turn up oscillator 2, it sounds like this. But you know, that's pretty basic, but listen to what happens when I now change the pitch of that oscillator. And you can hear that the pitch isn't actually changing, but the harmonic content is changing. And that's because the frequency, like the actual pitch of that oscillator, is locked to another oscillator. So that's where a lot of the character of this sound comes from. Now I think what's actually happening here is that we're listening to both oscillators. So I'm going to turn up oscillator 1 again. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add in some pitch envelope here. Now what that's going to do is basically turn this parameter for us following the envelope generator here. So if I turn oscillator 1 down again and add a bit of decay, it's basically sweeping through this oscillator 2 pitch but following the envelope. So that's getting in the ballpark of the sound. Something else that's a really important element of this sound is that it's a monophonic unison sound. So rather than being polyphonic, where you could play 8 notes at a time on the OBXa, it's actually stacking those 8 voices on top of each other, so you can only play 1 note, but you're getting 8 times the oscillators. And I can do that on the plugin here by just pressing unison and switching voices to 8. And what that is going to do is, at the moment, basically just make it louder. But the kind of key ingredient here is that this was an old analog synth, and so all of those 8 voices would have been slightly out of alignment with each other, and we can model that with the spread control here. So as I turn this up, you can hear that it starts to detune all of those oscillators and just sound much more interesting. And that's, you know, that's getting us pretty much in the ballpark there. Now you can see that I've got a little bit of glide added to the sound here. So that's basically meaning that if I play 2 notes, it's going to glide between them rather than stepping between them. That's a little bit much, but somewhere around here. And Matt Fink uses that glide really effectively in the solo. Something else that this plugin does, which is great, is it enables you to offset that glide time between different voices. So that's called glide slop here. And if I turn the glide up so you can really hear it, you can hear that all of those glides of the different voices are happening pretty much in time with each other. If I spread them apart, you get a really different effect. It sounds more like this. And if I make the glide time more, just to make that more obvious. It's a very cool effect. So I'm going to back that off a little bit, But all these things just kind of emulate the behavior of the analog synth a little bit more. So I think that's getting pretty close. I'm going to add a few effects here. These are very much my assumptions as to what might have been happening at the time, but I'm going to add a little bit of a stereo slapback delay, a little bit of mid-drive crunch, and a little bit of this Dimension D chorus. The Dimension D chorus is something that I know was regularly used in the 80s for keyboard parts, so I'm having a guess that it might have been used on this one. So let's take a look at some of the musical parts in this solo. So right at the opening, there's this long descending trill between two notes. And to do that on this plugin, you need to make sure that this bend octave button is pressed. That basically means that the pitch bend will let you bend down and up an octave as opposed to 2 semitones, which is usually the default. And then right after that trill, there's a long, low A note, which has got an effect that I think is really cool on it. It kind of sounds like a phaser effect, but just on one note. But I think what's actually happening is that he's changing that oscillator 2 pitch manually throughout the note. So what I've done here is I've mapped one of my MIDI controllers to change this oscillator 2 pitch, and that sounds like this. And then it goes straight into a part like this. And I love that. It's just playing a low note and a high note really quickly against each other with that quite slow glide time to get this kind of tremolo effect. And he does that quite a lot throughout the solo. So I love how all these elements come together. I think it's a really interesting way to use like the actual technology of the instrument to add to the character of the solo. So I'm going to let Matt play us out with a live version of this solo. Fantastic.